Time to move to the next session. Hopefully the mic is on. Yes, it is. Good. Well, that was a brilliant opening session. I thought. Thank you to Torrin for chairing it, and to the panelists, Dorothy, Mark, Polly, and of course to Mimi as well. Really grateful for that excellent session. The next session is equally topical. It's how should the internet be regulated? And to steer us through that session, we have Emma Goodman from the LSE Media Project. She's the policy officer at the LSE Media Policy Project, working on the Commission of Truth, Trust and Technology, which seems to be extremely relevant to this discussion this morning. So welcome to you, Emma, and I'll let you introduce the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're here to talk about how should the internet be regulated, which is a huge question. But I'm very happy to be here today with such a well-informed and thoughtful panel to discuss this crucial issue. I think over the past couple of years, there's been increasing consensus among policymakers in the UK and elsewhere that society needs further independent regulation of online services, which have until now been far less regulated than many traditional media organisations, particularly broadcasters. It's a question that has been asked for some years, but concerns about terrorist and extremist content, or about disinformation during elections, or about the potential for harms to children, such as cyberbullying or exposure to content that could lead to self-harm, have ground to the point where it really now feels as if we've moved from whether or not to do it to how to do it. And much of what these regulations are proposing to tackle is not necessarily new, but I think that the scale and speed at which something like disinformation, for example, can spread online has been eye-opening for many people. As well as the Lord's Communications Committee's report on regulating in a digital world, which we're going to hear about from Lord Gilbert. We've had a report from the DCMS Select Committee, which calls for more regulation for social media to tackle disinformation. The government has released a white paper proposing extensive measures to tackle what it describes as online harms. The Cabinet Office is looking at electoral interference and how to tackle disinformation online during elections. And that's just in this country. There has also been legislation in Germany, France, and at an EU level. So the tech companies have been taking some initiatives, but many believe that they haven't got far enough by themselves. And as they are forced to make increasingly difficult decisions, tech leaders themselves are also calling for more guidance. But I think that some of the biggest challenges, which have discouraged regulators in the past, remain. These include just how complex it is. It's international, involving global companies not headquartered in the UK. It's multi-layered, though current attempts focus only on the layer with which most users interact, which is online services. You have the issue that technology is always changing. And one of the big questions is how to regulate without limiting freedom of speech or any other freedoms. But freedom of expression advocates have issued strong warnings about the risks of over-censorship and of the risks that legal speech will be unintentionally restricted. There's also the issue of how to sufficiently protect children while not placing unnecessary restrictions on adults. And questions like, do we really want the internet to be safe? And what does that mean? I think what it comes down to is that many people think that it shouldn't be tech companies making all these complicated decisions. And so policymakers are trying to step in. And so now I would like to introduce first Lord Gilbert, who is chair of the Lord's Communications Committee, where he's led inquiries into the advertising industry, children and the internet, and is currently looking at the impact of video on demand on public service broadcasting. The committee recently published its final report of its Regulating the Internet inquiry, and I would like to ask Lord Gilbert if you could just explain to us the report's conclusions.
Thank you very much indeed, Emma. Thank you very much for the introduction and Colin too. I'm Stephen Gilbert. I chair the House of Lords Select Committee on Communications. But briefly, is sort of what is the House of Lords Select Committee's brief. We were established some years ago to scrutinise a BBC charter renewal as a one-off exercise, and then became an established committee. And our broad remit is the digital economy and the creative industries. Which increasingly, in my view, fit together in one important area of public policy making. They're both industries of the future, both potentially sort of AI-proof. They're going to be where jobs are in the future. They share an important set of issues around skills and access to people from different backgrounds, which are increasingly important if these are future industries where future jobs are going to be. It's ever more important that they're open to all. And there's a set of issues there, and there's a set of issues to both those important sectors around regulation. A lot of our work has featured regulation, though our current inquiry, which is underway at the moment, is almost back to where we started with the BBC Charter. It's the same set of issues. We're looking into the future of PSBs and PSB broadcasting. We're sort of asking quite a broad set of questions, and that's our current inquiry. And Colin, amongst others, others in this room have already given or will be shortly giving us evidence, and we are very grateful to that. We're quite a friendly committee. We try not to bring witnesses in and treat them like war criminals. And we're very focused on evidence, gathering evidence and coming to sensible public policy proposals rather than making political headlines, which is probably why you don't see much of us in the papers. So Emma, you said our last report was into regulating the digital economy, and we started off by asking part of the question, how do we regulate the internet? But it became clear to me, and I think to the committee, that wasn't really quite the right question. I think the real question is, how do you effectively regulate at all in the digital world, in this incredibly fast-moving world where everything moves at a pace? And I think it doesn't just apply to regulating the internet or regulating platforms. I think it applies to all forms of regulating, including financial services and all of the other regulated areas of the economy. Regulation is, in my view, a sort of analog process in a digital era. It is based on statute, statutory regulators, a statute that's renewed perhaps every 10 years, and that isn't the way regulation needs to work. On the other hand, the reversion to regulating by principle, which is a way around that of dealing with the fast-moving world, setting out a set of principles that are enduring, does have some democratic deficits. You give a lot of power of interpretation to an unelected regulator. So there's a democratic gap. How do we address these things? So that was the area we sort of started to look at in our report, though we did come up with some specific regulations for immediate regulation. So recognising that the thing that was driving everything forward at the moment is the pace, the scale and the innovation in the tech industries and amongst the big tech players in particular. And the lack of capacity, not just for Brexit reasons, the lack of capacity for government and policymakers to keep up with that innovation, that pace, and that scale. And we think, one of the things we think is that there needs to be a greater role for Parliament. That is not about interfering on a day-to-day basis with individual regulatory regimes, but asserting societal values and priorities and making sure that the regulatory framework is addressing those. Most importantly, though, we thought that the problem with the way we regulate at the moment is that it's all reactive. And forgive me for some of the audience in this room, regulation and the response of policymakers and politicians is to try and deal with the issue that was last on the front page of the Daily Mail or the Guardian, rather than looking forward at what is emerging in the tech sector and coming up with public policy solutions that address issues before they arise. The advantage of actually looking forward is that you may find that if you cooperate with the industry, you understand what's coming, you understand the future technology development, you can create public policy solutions that aren't regulatory, because you've got a grip of the issue before you reached it. So we proposed, rather than a proliferation of new regulatory bodies, and Emma, you mentioned the huge number of reports have already been published and a huge amount of work going on, they nearly all recommend at least one new regulatory body. We said, let's coordinate rather than proliferate. There are a lot. We have world-class regulators, in my view. Ofcom is a world-class regulator. Every witness we spoke to from around the world said they have a leading reputation. Information Commissioner Office, similarly. We've got world-class regulators. Let's really get those regulators working together, coordinate their work, build in over them an horizon scanning capacity. A UK centre of expertise that is looking forward at issues as they arise and is informing the industry, policymakers, government, society about what those issues are and recommending how they may be dealt with in a regulatory and non-regulatory fashion. Have a UK centre of expertise in terms of talent, one of the things that became clear to us is that it's very difficult for our regulators to recruit some of the best people, because as soon as they hire them, they're snapped up by the platforms and by the tech companies. So let's have, rather than asking each of our regulators to employ a bunch of experts, let's have at an overarching level a team of UK experts who are there to look to the future and also to work with all of the regulators to ensure they have access to that talent. And that we thought there's lots of advantages to this in Britain. I'm sorry to mention Brexit, not least in the post-Brexit world, where we need to find ways of ensuring that our world-class regulators continue to have clout and influence around the world. And we think one of the ways to do that is to get the very best out of them by creating what we call a digital authority. So rather than a pile of new individual regulators, a digital authority which is made up of the heads of the main regulatory bodies and some outside people, and this panel of future gazers, soothsayers, who are looking at issues as they rise, allocating the work to one of the existing regulators, and then, very importantly, we thought, reporting to Parliament on a quarterly basis, not an annual basis, not 2 years, on a quarterly basis, about the issues that are arising, identifying gaps in the regulatory framework, telling Parliament where there is a gap in resource or where more regulation is needed. And we felt that was a better solution than creating a regulator followed by another regulator followed by another regulator as we establish public policy concerns that need to be addressed. And as I say, we also thought this could become a very powerful asset for Britain post-Brexit, this digital authority with these world-class regulators feeding into it and informing public opinion. So that was sort of how our report looked at how we regulate in a digital age. We did recommend some specific short-term and immediate solutions. We did come down in favour of a duty of care, and we said rather than set up a new body to implement a duty of care, that Ofcom should take responsibility for that in the first instance. We did like the idea of enforceable terms and conditions on platforms, that they need to describe what kind of platform they are, what kind of environment they are, and that they need to stick to that. And that it's fine for them to say, if they say they're a family-friendly environment, then they must be family-friendly in terms of content. If they say we're an anything-that-goes environment, where anything that is legal is acceptable, that is fine too. But it needs to be clear and upfront about what they are, and they need to be held to account for that. And we also looked at issues around competition. We called for a public interest test for data-driven mergers. Not just a market competition test for data-driven mergers. We call for much real portability of data, not the limited portability that is currently being proposed. And we call for a CMA market study of the digital advertising market, which I think is really important to the future of our UK media. And we also called for an approach to ethical technology that took into account personal data controls, transparency, and a review and a process for examining algorithms. And then finally, we said that all regulation needs to be proportionate, relevant. It needs to take into account a whole range of issues, and critically, it needs to be enforceable. Whether it is through self-regulation or statutory regulation, needs to be enforceable and needs confidence in enforce. But we propose a set of 10 principles for regulation, but also, I think, importantly, for policy making. And rather than saying, here is the problem, which one of these principles applies, you look at the problem in this broader sense and apply all 10 principles to it and draw the balance between them. So the principles are about parity, which I think is a very, very important aspect, about accountability and transparency, but the principles also cover the importance of democratic engagement, of freedom of expression, and in making a regulatory choice or a policy-making choice, you have to account for all of these principles rather than work out how do we hammer this particular problem that has arisen and get it off the front pages and deal with it. And my final point is to the tech companies. I think this is a huge opportunity for the tech companies. For all of the travails that this country is going through, we have a very solid, reliable, predictable regulatory regime. which is not true of all countries in the world. The tech companies know that regulation is coming, and I think, Emma, they take the point that it is not for them to deal with a lot of these issues. It is for government, society, parliament to set a lead on some of these issues. What I would say to tech companies is work with the digital authority and this new regulatory framework and this new parliamentary approach. Contribute your ideas. Tell us openly now what the future developments are, and then let's work on a sensible, proportionate regulatory framework that could become a model for other jurisdictions around the world that meets your challenge of wanting to remain innovative and successful as businesses, and meets our challenge of wanting a digital environment and an economy that is open to everybody and that does not just doesn't do harm, but is a positive contribution to the future success of the country.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce Professor Richard Tait, who is now at Cardiff University. Richard has worked as a broadcaster for many years at the BBC, Channel 4, and he was editor-in-chief of ITN for several years. And he's also worked in broadcast regulation, first as a BBC governor and then a BBC trustee. So, Richard, Stephen mentioned Ofcom, which will likely have a significant role in whatever sort of regulatory framework emerges. So I was just wondering what you thought about what principles of broadcasting regulation do you think could work online?
Thank you. Well, I think there is not a direct read across clearly between online content and broadcasting, but they're sufficiently similar for us to be able to draw some lessons from our experience in broadcasting regulation over the years. Essentially, what we've evolved in the UK is, as Lord Gilbert points out, we're brand leaders in this area. And there are a number of countries which have tried to emulate the same systems or similar systems. So I think it's worthwhile exploring what we've learned from broadcast regulation to see whether there are some useful things we can learn when we look at a rather different proposition, which is broadcasting on social media, content uploaded onto social media, content being tweeted by people all around the world. It's a much bigger and more complex problem, but there may still be, as Lord Gilbert says, some principles which we can look at. Now, the essential building blocks of broadcast regulation, and I'm sure we've all recognised this, is first of all, there are some clear guidelines and rules. They're transparent, they're available to all of you as consumers, they're available to the broadcasters as the publishers, and they're available to the people who actually make the content. So everybody knows what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in British broadcasting. And that's important because if you don't have that, you can't really judge whether something's crossed a line or not. You have to know where the line is. Secondly, there's an obligation on the people who are publishing the content, and I think there's been a long argument about whether social media companies are platforms or publishers. They're clearly both. They have some of the characteristics of a platform in technology. They also have some of the responsibilities of publisher in the sense that they're putting out material to audiences. So there's a responsibility on the publisher to try and ensure that these rules are observed, to take prompt action if they're not, to take action actually against people who are uploading offensive content, beyond perhaps taking it down and saying, well, if you're going to do that, we don't want you on our platform because you're breaking our community rules or our editorial guidelines. Just in the same way as a broadcaster would say, well, if you're going to run this sort of story, we're not going to buy any more programs from you because your programs are breaking our hate speech, or they're they're racist, or they're simply not meeting our guidelines. But thirdly, and I think the Lords Committee was absolutely right to say no form of regulation will be effective unless it is enforced. We have an overarching independent regulator. It's not a state regulator. It's an independent public body, Ofcom, which has a number of roles. One role is it has to look at the complaints and compliance processes of the broadcasters, make sure they're doing what they said they do. Secondly, they have the right to say, actually, do you know, we're going to have to change this, and we're going to review the guidelines, because these guidelines are no longer protecting society, children perhaps, or any particular sector of society from abuse, and therefore we're going to change the rules and tighten the rules. And we've seen that with Ofcom and the protection of children over the years, and before that at the BBC Trust where I worked. If you feel there's a problem, you change the guidelines, and everybody has to accept that. But they also have to have, it seems to me, some form of backstop function, which says that in the end, if the self-regulation, if all the agreements and understandings don't work, we, the regulator, have been asked by society, and I think Lord Gilbert's suggestion that the regulators then report to Parliament is absolutely right. There needs to be the democratic mandate to do what then needs to be done. We are saying this is not good enough, and you will have to fix it. And if you don't fix it, there are a number of sanctions. In the case of broadcasting, the sanctions go from a public rap on the knuckles to a fine to actually losing your license to broadcast. So I think within that model, I'm not suggesting that that's an exact read across to social media. Of course it's not. But I think within that model, you can find some elements which could work. Interestingly, there's been a couple of attempts in Europe to look at this in specific cases where there's a perceived regulatory need. And the social media platforms, who up to very recently have been saying this is all impossible, we can't do any of this, we're technology people, we've got nothing to do with these issues at all, have actually accepted that a democratic state can say this is how it's going to be. One is hate speech in Germany, where initially Facebook were told there's a law in Germany, federal law, that says you can't propagate hate speech. Initially, Facebook offered a voluntary code and said, we will take the material down, trust us to do it. After a couple of years, the German government came back and said, well, we've done a review and we find that you're taking down about half of it. That's not good enough. For us, this really, really matters. And they've made a law. And the law is enforced by fines of up to 20 or in some cases 50 million euros. And Facebook has put in a lot of people who are now, on their behalf, checking the content, and they're taking it down within 24 hours. So if you want to take that approach, I'm not suggesting that should be approached for all situations, and there are big issues about freedom of expression. But if you want to take that approach, or if as a society you think this is so important you can take that approach, you can make the social media companies toe the line. Second example, which we're about to see how it will work in practice, is the French have put in a law in the run-up to the European elections that says that if somebody publishes a very damaging lie, there were some terrible stories about Macron, for example, for the French presidential election, which were simply not true. If somebody publishes something which is demonstrably untrue, you can go to a judge and say, look, let's not have this polluting our democratic process, and the social media company has to take it down, whether it wants to or not, on pain of a fine. So I think what we have is a situation where at one end there is a big stick, which is called democracy, and I would pay tribute to the Lords Committee and to the DCMS Committee at the Commons. They have changed the political weather in this country. 3 years ago, we would not be having this discussion. Ofcom was saying 3 years ago, we don't want to regulate the internet. It's far too scary. It's far too complicated. So the world has changed, partly because of the revelation of some of the scandals about some of the abuses that have been attributed to social media, but also because some very good analytical work has been done by these committees, which really give you the evidence base on which you can now base policy. Can it be done? Yes, it can, but it will require quite a lot of will and effort, because these companies will not want to do it. Not because they're bad people, but because they have been set up to be technology-based platforms. They're run in the main by brilliant engineers and marketing people. They don't necessarily at this stage in their managerial structures have the same balance of editorial experience, which, for example, a broadcaster would have to have, or indeed a newspaper, to be aware of the implications of compliance, the compromises you have to make with compliance, and frankly, the costs of compliance. Because currently they are getting a bit of a free ride, They're publishing material, but they're not spending all the money that I spent, certainly at ITN, and the BBC did, and newspapers do, in trying to check their material is compliant, training their staff properly, making sure they have a proper complaints process. All of this is part of the cost of being a publisher, and it's a very big cost. And I'm not surprised that the platforms are going to resist that, in the sense that they want to try, obviously, to be as profitable and successful as possible. So I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think that with the right will and with a flexible approach, and I absolutely agree with Lord Gilbert, the key thing is not to say, this is how it's going to be forever, because this industry and this area is moving so fast that you can't set in stone how you're going to do it. But if we have the will to regulate these platforms, we can do so, and actually we'll then get all the benefits that they bring without the downside.
Yeah.
So I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Victoria Baines, who is a visiting fellow at Bournemouth University doing research on online trust, safety and cybersecurity. And she has worked in cybersecurity for some years, including a stint at Facebook as Trust and Safety Manager. So I was thinking, among all these calls for further regulation of online services, there's been a lot of talk about regulation by principles or duty of care, but what about the practicalities? How is this going to work?
Well, you mentioned that this is a very complex topic, and I generally go to internet regulation workshops that last 2 days or a week. But to Mark's point earlier about how we squeeze some of these news items into a few minutes for the Today programme, I have also got used to talking about this in 3 minutes. So let's see how I go. Now, I need to explain to you a little bit about my background. Stick with me because this will be relevant. So my doctorate is actually in classical rhetoric. So my natural tendency is to view what anybody says, and that includes all of you, but particularly public pronouncements about issues like security, with a healthy, and my husband would say an unhealthy amount of suspicion. But I spent 10 years in law enforcement, both in the National Crime Agency, its predecessor, and as deputy head of the European Cybercrime Centre at Europol, and I was responsible for national and international threat assessment of cybercrime and online safety. So I wear that hat as well. I have that filter. But then I spent 4 or 5 years in Facebook, predominantly working as law enforcement liaison. So when kids went missing, when terrorist attacks happened, that was me on the phone to MI5, to CEOP, to assist them with following up on that. I have also been in the firing line from ministers and from governments around the world who told me I was doing nothing, while I knew I was doing quite a lot. And this speaks to one of the principles that I think the Select Committee's report is absolutely bang on about, and that's transparency. Why are we where we are right now with what appears to be a public discourse, but isn't? It's the government and the media and tech companies fighting each other and getting defensive, and the voice of the citizen, I would argue, not necessarily being represented as clearly as we might like. That's where, dare I say, civil society organisations have got a very, very important role to play in how we regulate the internet. How did we get here? Well, because social media companies in particular and large US technology companies have been very, very defensive and even silent about what they were doing to keep people safe. And to counter abuses. And so it's been very, very easy for all of the rest of us, and I say I'm the rest of us now because I left Facebook and I'm outside this, it's all too easy for us to assume they're doing nothing. It's also all too easy for us to try and put what I think are unrealistic expectations of the digital world. And I think it's quite important that the Select Committee report stresses parity. That we treat what is offline as also, if it's acceptable offline, it's acceptable online. Conversely, if it's illegal or unacceptable offline, it's illegal and unacceptable online. So we need to really question how we're going about this. And Emma mentioned one of the plethora of reports that we've seen in the last few months. I'll just read a quote from one of those, which I won't name. public opinion is growing increasingly intolerant of the abuse which big technology companies have failed to eliminate. So I've worked a lot of my time on offline crime. I used to do burglaries, I used to map drug deals, violent crime. We know that when you ask people in the British Crime Survey how afraid they feel of crime, there's a mismatch between their perceptions and their actual experiences. We also don't expect in our lifetimes never to be burgled, never to encounter offline harm. But we seem to be applying an expectation that we will eliminate online harm and that tech companies will be an important stakeholder in that. So I'd like to encourage everybody to reset their expectations. It's tricky in the current political, rhetorical environment. But if everybody involved, civil society, tech companies, government, media has a part to play to be responsible in this as well, if they can all play their part to minimize online harm wherever possible, equip people to be resilient to deal with online harm when they encounter it, that feels to me to be a much more reasonable expectation. Now, Richard's examples of Germany and France are actually negative examples in my book, and I'll tell you why. The NetzDG, the German hate speech law, as it's colloquially known, there is some evidence emerging now that tech companies are so afraid of being fined that they are removing too much material unprompted. So there is some reporting emerging at the moment that this law has created something of a chilling effect, that stuff which is undesirable or unpalatable, as well as just straightforward illegal, is also being removed. That's something I want to caution against. France is a great example of where we also need quality control of the people sending the requests to remove content. Because you can find online a blog from the Internet Archive where they complained publicly about the fact that they received 550 takedown notices from France's counterterrorism internet referral unit, where within an hour it was demanded that they remove archive websites for mainstream news channels, news archives, academic publications. And it's not that France was being malicious here, or even that these people were throwing their weight around unnecessarily. There just clearly hadn't been sufficient quality control to check their facts, as well as the facts of the material that was being circulated. So, you know, to quote one of my favorite, well, to quote the subject of my PhD, Juvenal, the satirist, who will guard the guards? Because that kind of quality control is important. Now, with the UK, I am on alert for mission creep. And in the recent online harms papers, both the Green Paper and the White Paper, in the Green Paper, satire was included in the definition of fake news. Because, to paraphrase, some people can't tell the difference between satire, fake news, and truth. I would imagine that's something we all want to keep. We have a fantastic tradition of satire in the UK that I would not like to see chilled. And equally, in the recent White Paper, we have terrorist propaganda, quite rightly. We have child sexual abuse material, quite rightly. In the same paper and the same proposed approach to online harms, for which, incidentally, there is no agreed evidence-based definition. There is no academically agreed taxonomy of online harms, and that is something we desperately need. DCMS and the Home Office have included material recorded in prisons. It's in there as a section. Now, I've been on the receiving end of this when I was working at Facebook. The government is not happy that people smuggle phones into prisons, record people taking spice and being under the influence of drugs or doing silly dances. Because, of course, it's illegal to take phones and communications devices into prisons, and there's a bit of a security issue with that at the moment. I hope you would agree with me, that is an issue of public interest. But under ill-thought-out regulation, that could be something that social media platforms will have to remove, because it undermines confidence in government institutions. So beware mission creep, Beware ill-thought-out operationalisation of very, very good, I think, principles. I'd like to suggest we start again. That, yes, tech companies need to be more transparent. They need to tell you what they're doing with your data. Absolutely. That's one of the reasons why Facebook got into so much trouble over Cambridge Analytica with the Information Commissioner's Office. But equally, I think we need to start having a bit more of a respectful dialogue. It's all too easy to treat tech companies as folk devils.
Yeah.
And I've started doing a bit of work on security rhetoric and how governments talk about tech companies. And I'll finish, if I may, with a very quick quote from David Cameron, which I don't normally channel David Cameron. I think this is probably the first time I've ever done it in public. So you will remember the horrible murder of the soldier Lee Rigby. And the Intelligence and Security Committee reported that Facebook could have prevented that murder. Now, I was working at Facebook at the time, and I won't give too much away by saying that they absolutely couldn't have prevented a murder. They could have perhaps shared information. Had they been conducting proactive surveillance of, at the time, 1.5 billion people's private messages. And had there been a legal framework to report that to UK authorities. I think that's where the regulation piece is really important, is enabling the tech companies to do that. But David Cameron's response I thought was really interesting, because I think what he did was he essentially equated tech companies with terrorists. And so to quote from the Telegraph, David Cameron accused internet companies of failing to assist in the fight against terrorism, warning that they had a moral duty to act because their networks are being used to plot murder and mayhem. Now, the basic fact, I think, is fair. Networks being used to plot murder and mayhem, that's slightly inflammatory. I think the rhetorical term for that would probably be hyperbole. But he goes on. He claimed the heads of global web firms had a distorted libertarian ideology. So by that token, that is something that is opposed to UK values, I suppose, if the Prime Minister's talking about that made them wholly detached from responsibility to governments and to the peoples that we democratically represent. He has effectively set up an ideological opposition between the UK citizenry, the UK government, and tech companies. And that's the kind of rhetoric that I think is really unhelpful, because that opposition never needed to happen. Going forward, tech companies have their part to play in sharing with government what they're doing. But I would also like to appeal to the media amongst you to be slightly more discerning in questioning what the government is saying about this. And personally, I make it my business to make sure that the government is properly informed about what's actually happening and that we do have a robust evidence base. Thank you.
I'm just going to ask a couple of follow-up questions. To start with, Lord Gilbert, I was wondering what you thought about the online harms white paper from the government and how it compares to the recommendations that you've made in your report.
I think, on the whole, I mean, it's out for consultation, obviously. On the whole, I think many of the proposals are sensible, and indeed we call for some of the proposals. We called for a duty of care, though there are quite a lot of issues around a duty of care. It is very complex. I mean, it's a very attractive idea, and I do think that it should be part of the response that is short of full-on statutory set of rules and is principles-based. So we do support, for example, the call for a duty of care. What I think the white paper failed to do was look to the future. I think it is yet another reactive piece of proposed legislation, which is to look at a set of issues which are causing anxiety in society at the moment and come up with a solution to them, rather than looking at where we're going to be over a foreseeable time frame and coming up with a wide set of proposals, including regulation, some of the very important approaches that Victoria was talking about. I think a framework in which the tech companies can operate, I think, is a very important part of it. And if that were if that were implemented, for example, with goodwill from both sides, it would mean that you needed less statutory regulation. So I think that's where it misses. I think much of the content is fine, but it addresses the problems of here and now, the front page of the Daily Mail and the Guardian, not the big issues that are emerging.
Thank you. And Victoria, I was wondering, you mentioned how we should be equipping people to deal with the risk of online harms. How would you go about starting to do that? I know it's a huge question, but...
So one of the phrases that I hear quite a lot from fellow researchers is that we're trying to fix a societal problem with a technical silver bullet. And guess what? There isn't a technical silver bullet for people's critical judgment when they view a news item, be that a fake news item, be that an extreme post by a legitimate political party, be that satire, or be that something that a friend has posted. Now, fixing a societal problem is never easy and it takes time. It's not politically expedient. It's much more politically expedient to blame tech companies and tell them that their algorithms need to get better. My concern is that if we treat people like they're idiots, we will get idiots, particularly in subsequent generations. So if we are removing all the harm and all the fake news, we will then have a generation of people who can't tell the difference. Conversely, a recent study by Harvard, I think it was, identified that during the US presidential elections in 2016, over 65s were the age group most likely to share fake news. So, as much as I have championed child protection over the last 10, 15 years, I do wonder whether we have a vulnerability in the older age group that we're so used to trusting the media that we see that actually we need to relearn critical thinking in the digital age. Well, I'm sorry, I'm nearly there. But you know, I think that's an important point, actually, that I've spent ages investigating cybercrime, but I still see things that are too good to be true, but are convincing, and I click on. So back to that expectation, it's not cheap to train an entire population how to spot things, but it definitely needs to be done. And so when we see in the US the activities of organizations like Newseum, that is encouraging not just external third-party fact-checking, but getting people to think twice about what they're seeing, that is as important as getting the tech companies to remove this material.
Thank you. And Richard, I was thinking, you know, obviously as a former journalist, do you think that there is a way to regulate the internet in a different way while still ensuring the sort of fantastic opportunities for freedom of expression that it has provided so far?
Well, I'm not as far from Victoria's position as maybe she thinks I am. I've been a journalist for most of my career, and I believe absolutely in freedom of expression. And I think what we've done in broadcast regulation is we found a compromise between basically Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees freedom of expression, and the need, democratically expressed through our political system, that you need to have certain forms of regulation of content on the most powerful media that people use. And that's why we've always had regulation of broadcasting, because it was seen as being so influential and so powerful that it was very dangerous for society for it to fall into the hands of any particular political or commercial faction. And we've managed to avoid that, and that the content should be, as far as possible, meeting certain very broad standards of decency, probity, and fairness. And I think we can extend that to the online world. I think it's not either or. I think it's not simply relying on media literacy, because I don't think that alone will do it, because you're dealing with, in some cases, with people who are incredibly clever and very ill-intentioned, and will find a way around media literacy. I'll give you an example of the There was the fake Macron front page of a newspaper which said that he was being paid for by the Saudi Arabians. It was a newspaper front cover. A lot of people looked at it and said, my goodness, this is a big scandal. It's been checked by a reputable Belgian newspaper. The whole page was a fake. To be made up in a computer and played out. And 16,000 retweets before somebody caught up with it. Yeah. So that's, and if you look at the sort of archaeology of the web, right down the bottom, there are very, very dark sites which are producing fake stories, malicious stories, very, very unpleasant stories, which bubble up through different gatekeepers, and sometimes they get picked up on social media, sometimes they get picked up even on news channels. They get picked up by newspapers, and they're complete rubbish, and they're very dangerous. And you have to have some sort of system whereby the reputable platforms, and Facebook is, for many people, 45 million people in America think Facebook is their source of news. Yeah. These are really important platforms. They believe, because actually, you know, and we discussed it in the previous session on politics, actually, British journalism is quite good. It tries its best, it's not perfect, but people in the main can believe what they see on television. Newspaper journalism in Britain is quite good. It may be partisan, but there's a tradition of factual reporting and accurate reporting in British newspaper journalism, which is met by the editor's code and is regulated by IPSO. We've got a tradition of people believing factual information when they see it. And I think, although I'm absolutely with Victoria that media literacy can help people see things, you can have kite marks, you can have fact-checking apps, there's lots of ways you can help people, but you also have to have the responsibility of the platforms that say, you are giving me your business, and in return for that, I'm going to spend quite a lot of money and quite a lot of effort in trying to make sure that as much as is possible, what you're seeing is within my guidelines. And that doesn't mean that we should have censorship, and I think Victoria's quite right about mission creep. I think the civil servants have been trying to slip a couple of curveballs into the white paper. I mean, the one on prisons is nonsense. That's should nothing to do with the wider issue of the impact of social media on society. So we should be very careful that freedom of expression isn't one of the casualties of this, because that's absolutely the opposite of what I'm saying.
Could I just follow up on that, Richard? That was a really good example with the state-sponsored disinformation, the coordinated disinformation campaigns, because that's where tech companies really can help, because you can, you know, identify where this stuff has come from. You can take down entire networks. You can work with law enforcement on you know, dismantling those networks. But it's also a very good example of where there needs to be a nuanced approach to the idea of fake news, because fake news is a spectrum. Yeah. And so if you put all of that on tech companies, you're missing the societal piece. But equally, as you quite rightly say, Richard, if you just try and make people resilient to fake news, you're allowing quite coordinated organised crime groups and state-sponsored bad actors to flourish.
Thank you. So I want to take some questions from the audience, but to start with, I have one question for Lord Gilbert from a member who couldn't be here, which is about regulation of online dating sites. Because this member has been scammed on online dating sites and wants to know if there's anything that you're proposing to do about that.
We didn't take a huge amount of evidence in relation to online dating sites, but as everybody knows, they are huge. And a lot of people use them. A lot of people these days met through online dating sites. I mean, socially, they are an incredible phenomenon, and on the whole, not bad things. And I think quite an important aspect to this is a sort of general point about these businesses. I don't believe that the big tech companies and the big platforms are bad people doing bad things. I think they're people developing incredible new innovative things, and they are good people. They are like us. They share all of our concerns about society and the way we live today. So we didn't sort of take a view of dating sites that they need to be regulated because they're a problem. But we also didn't specifically look at the issues. I mean, they would be covered by the duty of care proposal, would apply to dating sites, and that, above all else, puts an onus on the companies to design their ways and have systems in place where foreseeable risks are averted.
Okay, thank you. Can we take some questions from the audience, maybe at the back? Somebody, right?
Peter York. I'd like to ask Dr. Baines, who is clearly very informed about Facebook and quite close to it, how much Facebook and Google are spending with K Street, Washington lobbyists to support astroturf libertarians, to support people who will delay the onset of regulation and blunt it. I would suggest it is nearing the billions. Is that defensible?
I have no idea about that. I'm
Well,
sorry.
we should be told.
Oh,
Find out.
Yes.
You've got lots of friends in Facebook.
No,
You
sorry.
can find out. You're a proper academic. You can go to Facebook and you can publish or perish. You can
Right.
tell us about it.
So, first
It's a
thing,
great deal of money, and the object of the exercise is to delay and blunt the onset of regulation. I could turn to my iPad here and dial up an alternative theory, very expensively proposed, about the murder of Joe Cox. It's still there.
is that a question or a comment? Because it
It's a
sounds more like a
question, it's a
comment
question
than a question.
and a comment.
Right. So
Do you know how much? Do we know how much is being spent on that initiative by those companies?
So, I haven't worked for Facebook since October 2017. I am not party to inside information at Facebook. I can tell you about my experiences, and I worked as law enforcement liaison in relation to online safety. Okay, so that's all I can tell you about. Peter, you raise a really important point, and it kind of aligns with what I was saying about transparency. Academics have been thumping this tub for quite a long time, saying, look, we don't have access to data from social media platforms about users, you know, for even social science research. To the best of my knowledge, there's been a public announcement that Facebook is going to allow social science researchers to analyse this information. But you have a perfectly valid point, which is the companies do need to be more transparent, because if they're not, we are able to make assumptions about what they may or may not be doing. So it's only to the good for them to do so.
And there's a couple of questions over here.
Yes, there's one area, Graham Mitton, there's one area of regulation which we haven't talked about, and this is not a criticism, you can only get so much into, we're overrunning anyway. But in the days before online, local newspapers in this country got all their money from advertising, and they were profitable, and they put money into journalism. All that advertising, or most of it, has gone online. You know the rest of the question. Is it not possible to regulate things? I think the French have done this, so that the big online companies do put some money at least into good journalism.
I think this is a really important point, and as you say, we weren't able to cover everything. The previous report of my select committee was on the advertising industry, actually, and again, we started off with one question and moved on to another, and the question was about skills in the advertising industry and the future role of the advertising industry post-Brexit, but it very quickly came down to the digital advertising market. And there are a lot of problems with the digital advertising market. There is a huge amount of fraud in the digital advertising market. I mean, I won't quote a number because I don't have it in front of me, but in the billions of dollars of fraud in the digital advertising market. And the way in which it has shifted and so quickly has caused real problems to journalism. to both to local newspapers and also to national newspapers too, frankly. And it is a societal problem. And I think when we look at all of these issues about the problems that the country faces, it's not all just a case of blaming the tech companies, but they are undesirable things that are happening societally, and we need to come up with societal solutions as well as dealing with tech solutions. But we certainly called for, and we repeat our call for an examination, a Competition and Market Authority examination of the digital advertising market, which in our view is a seriously problematic market.
And I'd like to take the questions down here, if we can. There's two in that row.
Lizzie Jackson, London South Bank University, but I'm here on behalf of the new International Association of Public Service Media Researchers, which will be launching in October. A question and two little bits of information. How do you think the BBC can support the regulation of the internet? First thing is the internet is very large. Which bit of the internet? The second point is the BBC's editorial policy guidelines have been going since 1997. There's a lot of material in there about regulation of social media. A chap called Julian Coles, the senior editorial policy advisor, and others, including myself, worked on it when I was the BBC's social media manager. But there's a tremendous wealth of information there. The second is the new Policy and Evidence Centre, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, run by Nesta, 10 universities, the Creative Industries Federation, BFI, TechNation, Intellectual Property Office. I've just started. They would be a superb vehicle to aggregate this sort of thing. And they've just issued their first newsletter, so that they would be a body who should be involved. So my question is, how do you think the BBC should be involved?
I think I'll have a go. Then you can think of response to. Look, I think the BBC has got an important role to play in a number of areas. I mean, our committee actually visited the BBC, and they have this thing called the Blue Room, where they have sort of every bit of technology that is sort of hardware technology that is developing that demonstrate how we consume the media, and it is fascinating. And I think there is expertise in the BBC. Which I think should be part of this future-looking body that I talked about, of UK expertise, looking to the future, understanding what technological developments are going to be, and coming up with public policy solutions to them. So I think the BBC is a great centre of expertise, technical as well as creative, and I think they could be a part of that digital authority, forward-looking horizons kind of thing. Very interesting what you said about PEC, who I saw them yesterday actually, came in to introduce themselves, and I think they are potentially a great centre for evidence. For those looking at public policy solutions in this area. Just one other aspect of the BBC, and the issue that concerns me, which we haven't talked about, and it is a societal thing, which we see through the prism of technology, and that is, the increasing evidence that everything is in an echo chamber these days. I really worry about Twitter as an echo chamber, social media as an echo chamber. I did something very interesting. I set up 2 Twitter profiles. In one, I describe myself as a sort of leftish person. In the other, I describe myself as a rightish person. I follow people on the right, and I follow people on the left. And I just get deluged with just constant repetition and recommendations in line with what I said. And and nothing else gets through. So I think one of the things that tech companies, and I think the BBC should be looking at, is how they make sure that as we develop tech, we aren't just creating echo chambers, because it really, really worsens this ugly identity politics set of issues that we have at the moment. And I think it's not a tech problem, but I think it's a societal problem born in the way tech is currently being used.
Okay, thank you. Sadly, I think we're going to have to wrap up now, but it's lunchtime now, so maybe any questions can be directed to the panelists during lunch.
Thank you.